Welcome to the Voice of Russia's weekly international panel, where London links up with Moscow and Washington, D.C. In London, I'm Hywel Davies.
In Moscow, I'm Yevgeny Sukhoi.
And in Washington, D.C., I'm Ric Young. On today's program, we're going to discuss whether inequality is fueling Islamophobia. London?
And whether policy mistakes by governments have served to radicalize young Muslims both in the West and Russia.
And we're going to discuss if Islam is the source of radicalism and aggression here in Russia with our political analysts, Dmitry Kosyrev and Dmitry Babic.
And in Washington, we're joined by Kevin Ekstrom, editor of Religion News Service, an agency concerned with matters of religion, ethics, and moral issues, and by Tarin, the director of the Washington, D.C. office of the Muslim Public Affairs Council. How?
Here in London, I'm talking to Taufik Razimi, who's of the Christian Muslim Forum and head of the Muslim Welfare House, and by Dr. Carool, senior lecturer in the study of Islam and the Muslim world at King's College London. If I might start with you, Taufik, it's undeniable that a small number of Muslims, predominantly young men, have been radicalised over the last decade in Europe and Russia. What do you think are the main factors driving this?
Well, let me just start by correcting. My name is Kasimi, and the names or the title is most of the time or often given by the media is quite shocking. You're talking about a very small minority, really marginalized people who are radicalized, and it's not Islam, but the titles is given often, like today, for example. It sounds like Islam is the source of extremism or terrorism or radicalism. Radicalism itself exists in all faiths, in all ways, in all walks of life. It's not specific to Islam. And you'll find people with this way of living, with this way of thinking in all walks of life. So why talking about Islam? There is two different things. If we talk about radicalism itself, that's subject. If we're talking about Islam, it's not a religion of radicalism, is not a faith of terrorism. Islam is very nice. It means peace, actually. Islam actually always try to promote peace in the whole world. It does not promote any terms in any extremism in any walks of life. But the media, unfortunately, is given different titles, and we're not really happy about it. Most of Muslims are quite upset about it.
But it is undeniable, surely, that there are people who are, the Metropolitan Police has charged, and they've been convicted, 300 people who say that they were fighting for an Islamic caliphate, for example. 300 people have been arrested on terrorism offences in this country. You don't find that with say, there's not 300 Jewish extremists being locked up in this country. It is a particular problem, is it not?
I agree with you, but there is a problem with these people, these specific people which you're talking about. It's not about the religion. If you want me to join you in this fight against extremism, let's work together. Even Muslims will join you, but Muslims, you don't want to exclude Muslims from this fight. We have a major fight. The extremists exist as well. If you look at Burma, Arakan people is being killed by Buddhists. Is Buddhism as a religion itself extremist? No, it's not. Definitely it's not. IRA or many other...
I'm sorry, really sorry. There aren't many Buddhists being arrested for terrorism offences in this country, for example.
Possible, but what I'm saying to you is the fight should be against the extremists. It comes from Catholicism, Christianism, Judaism, or Islam, or Buddhism. It doesn't matter. Extremism is a danger for the human being. When bombs are being posted in London Underground, Muslims are killed too. So we look at the problem as a problem. We don't look at the religion. Islam was never a source of problems. The source of the wrong understanding, the wrong interpretation of these people. Nothing wrong with Islam. There is two different things. We have to distinguish between the two. If you want me to join you as a Muslim, I'll be happy to join you to defend our own way of living against extremism, yes. But when you stay talking about the source of this extremism is Islam itself, then you'll have a problem with 1.5 billion people who live on Earth.
So you're trying to say that perhaps that we need to separate these two things and keep extremism and religion as separate constructs in a way?
Exactly. We have major problem with extremism, fundamentalism, and all these of things. We have a problem with them. We don't have problem with the religion itself. And unfortunately, some part of media are reporting like the problem exists with Islam. And most of the Muslim, 1.5 billion people who live in Earth, will not agree with you. So why don't you have me, like a Muslim or any Muslim in the world, let's fight against this ideology, which which is really a danger for all our way of living. We are all with you on that. But as soon as you start talking about Islam, sorry, I can't hear you, because the religion have nothing wrong with it.
Dr. Kersten, is this a common feeling among Muslims and around the world? Is this feeling that they're being unfairly painted by the actions of a very small minority?
Yeah, and I think they have a point, because as Taufik pointed out, radicalization is a fringe phenomenon. You cannot deny it, but it is indeed a political and a security issue. It's not a religious question. You can also not isolate the phenomena or incidents in Russia or in the UK from wider developments that affect the Muslim world. In this information age, news travels fast, it's 24/7. So it is actually political problems, long-lasting political problems, which affect the Muslim world, that spill over into, well, I call them the Muslim diasporas in Western Europe, North America and Australia. But they have indeed nothing to do with the religion as such, but with, very difficult to resolve problems within the Muslim world. And if you try to isolate the phenomena, I think you're fooling yourself. You don't get a correct picture. And also, I think it's wrong to limit it, to talk about it is in the last decade. Most of these problems are decades, sometimes centuries old, and they go back to the whole age of imperialism and colonization, because most Muslim countries which are now independent are still struggling with the colonial legacy, whether it's with respect to borders, the makeup of the population and things like that. And I think that is often forgotten. The immigrant populations carry that legacy with them, and what happens in their respective home countries, of course, still affects them. And in certain instances, that leads to, with some people, to, radicalization. I think really it's not so much a misnomer, but it really limits it to a very small phenomenon. But there are reactionary Muslims who are equally upset about these problems, but would not resort to violence, for example. But they want these issues to be addressed.
Is one of the problems, as you say, is that we now have a 24-hour media culture where if you are a young Muslim man on the verge and perhaps sort of being very aggrieved about your situation, and you see your co-religionists being killed in, I don't know, Israel or Iraq, something like that, you might well become radicalized, for want of a better word.
I think that can push people over the brink, and that's where the security and the political issue would come in, and I would even say the psychological issue. Because a lot of these people, I think their Muslim identity is almost secondary to the act. It's their psychological makeup, which is probably on the border of pathology already, that drives them to these kind of acts. Another thing that I think is very important to point out when you look at media influences is the danger of copycatting. Phenomena that you see the world over are not necessarily connected. And the whole idea about Al-Qaeda is this octopus operating from the borderlands of Afghanistan and Pakistan is misleading. I mean, the very name of the organization is wrong. It's called, the base, but it's a network. And these are very loose structures, and often, if they are even in touch with each other, operating autonomous. That's exactly the challenge for the security community. But a lot of people act on their own, and you're dealing with soloists who decide to do something.
Taufik, do we have a problem here in that many actions, and going back many decades, by Western governments, but more particularly, I think, since 9/11, the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan in particular, they have served to make the 26 million Muslims who live in Europe feel slightly alienated from their host countries to some extent?
I agree. I think it is a problem, and the media is actually enforcing this view, unfortunately. I would prefer, as a Muslim living in the UK, to have more engagement with the government, with the media, with all sectors of life. There is no point of starting accusing my religion, which I love dear, of being extremist religion, of a source of uncomfort or instability within life. It is not. Unfortunately, the British government itself, with the Prevent agenda, which really now exclude Muslims from the sorting the problem, or look at the Muslims as a source of a problem rather than a solution to the problem. And there is many other parts of the government itself which think, no, we have to engage in better way with the Muslims. We have to listen to the Muslims. Let us work together to sort out the problems. And I can tell you the problem in the mosque, which used to be major problem in Finsbury Park. The government dealing with it at the time was very positive. That they approached us at Muslim Welfare House and asked us to help them, and we solved the problem. Look at Finsbury Park Mosque now. It's a very good example of how people can work together. Last week or month, we had a Islamophobia conference, which was attended by Jeremy Corbyn, by many very well-known people, including the police, the government representative, and it went extremely well. So, look, when the government really engaging with the Muslim to solve up the problems, these problems are not unique to Muslims. They are actually universal. And what we want to say here, let's work together to sort out the problems we have. I have major problems and concerns with the media. When they start last week, for example, the Times reporting extremists preaching violence to students, big title like this, Islam is a source of violence, or Oxford grooming sex something. So why always relating, associating Islam as a religion with extremism or with the grooming or with things which is very bad? I think journalists, sometimes they look for stories and they love bad stories. And most of the time now you'll find veil, hijabs, Muslim terrorists. If he's a terrorist, he's a criminal. Go and jail him. Why you associating this criminal with Islam? If he's a radical, if he's extremist, do something about his first mental state, then take him to jail. It has nothing to do with the religion whatsoever.
Are you slightly worried by the fact that there was a recent survey by the Bertelsmann Foundation which showed that sort of 60-70% of the population in many European countries, including France and Germany, were very distrustful of Islam? They found that for 60-70% of them of these two countries said, look, they saw it as a religion which preached hate. Is that causing a sort of rising tide of Islamophobia, do you think? There's growing mistrust?
I think there is nothing wrong with the general public in UK, in France, in Germany, in Italy, everywhere. We have long work with Muslim Welfare House, with our co-partners, Christian, Jewish, through IFF, which is Islamic Faith Forum. We also work in Christian Muslim Forum, and we have long served together. We work together. There is no problems. But the problem is actually in the mind of some media writers. They think there is a problem with mistrust, there is a problem with dishonesty within the Muslims living in the Western countries. And I tell you, this problem only exists in the mind of some people. The general public, they don't have no problem. Oh, some, of course, right-wings activists, which think that Islam is a threat to equality, Islam is a threat to their resources of income. Muslims only are economical immigrate, they came to take their resources, then these people may think Islam is source of inconvenience in Europe. But most of the people, I don't believe that they have any problem with Islam.
Okay, if we might pass over to Ric in Washington for the moment.
Yes, Hal, thank you very much, and thank you to your guests. We have here in Washington Kevin Ekstrom. He's editor of the Religion News Service, an agency concerned with matters of religion, ethics, and moral issues, and by Harris Tarin, the director of the Washington, D.C. Office of the Muslim Public Affairs Council. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us.
Sure. Thank you.
You've heard some of the comments from London regarding how the media, and that's a very broad term, but how the media looks at Islam, but usually in the context of violence. Do they have a point here? Tarin?
Right. Well, I think there is a tendency within the media to sensationalize stories, and I think that is something that that everybody knows is part of the reporting process of finding stories that'll catch the viewer's eye or the listener's ear. Sensational. So there's no question that we're dealing with those types of with that phenomenon. but there also are real questions that need to be answered. There is an issue with radicalization. Whether you want to say that religion is the source of the problem or not, that's a different question. But there is. The public does feel that there's a threat out there. There are national security questions. There are issues of perception that American Muslims are going through as well. And so there is definitely a factor that the media is playing into this conversation and at times sensationalizes the conversation. But there's also the reality that it is not the only issue.
But also, let's face it, most Americans became acquainted with the issue and the religion of Islam only through the terrorist acts. I mean, generally speaking, most people don't live next door to Muslim neighbors, right? As in most countries, most people are segregated culturally, religiously, racially. Right. So isn't that also part of our problem in the sense that we're not looking at the Muslim community as a whole community, but seeing it purely through the acts of, as the London guest said, the acts of a few?
Yes, and I think the research suggests that American Muslims, those who have a personal relationship with their neighbors are generally are able to see them in a more positive light and don't see them in a negative light. So that personal interaction or relationship definitely is something that needs to be focused on. But I wouldn't say that Islam is only seen through a terrorist action, through that prism.
But through the media.
And even in the media, I would say that there are also positive portrayals of American Muslims, and I think it's increasing. You have American Muslims in arts and cultures. You've got American Muslims in various in politics and political and civic life, and so in the entertainment industry. So I think that is slowly changing. I think what the challenge for the American Muslim community is to get beyond what they have done in the past 30 to 40 years, which is industries like medicine and engineering and various other sciences, where they've sought socioeconomic stability and moving into more of the social sciences and the arts and culture and journalism and reporting. And once that happens, I think you'll see that the images and the portrayals will also become more positive.
Well, Kevin, again, you're dealing with ethics, morals regarding how we perceive the Muslim community in this country. As you know, in the Boston Marathon bombing case, the initial reports came out as two dark-skinned or possibly Arab-looking men. Back in 1996, during the Oklahoma City bombing, the first reports went out were 4 Arab-looking men.
Right.
So is it something in either the American psyche, in the media, that we immediately go to that stereotype as opposed to, in some respects, waiting to find out what's going on?
Right. Well, I think that has been a problem in the past, and I think it continues to be a problem in some segments of the media. I think it's getting better, and I think what we saw in Boston this year was less a quick rush to judgment saying that this must have been a Muslim act. I know in our own newsroom, we didn't know what had caused it initially because it happened during the week of a number of tragic anniversaries here in the States. The Waco bombing. It was Patriots Day. It was Columbine school shootings all happened that week. We didn't know if this was, a crazy gun fanatic or what. So we were trying to be very cautious about making the immediate jump to Islam. And as you referred to, there were some reports that it was a Saudi national or, some dark-skinned guy, and it turned out not to be the case. But I think, I want to go back to what your guest in London was saying. And yes, the media can and needs to do a better job. And I know in our shop, we are trying to be very careful about terms like Islamic extremist or Muslim terrorist, because those aren't always the most accurate or the most useful words. But that being said, I think part of the problem here is there is a segment of the Muslim community that refuses to acknowledge what's basically the facts. We don't have Lutherans going out bombing people. This is not an Anglican problem. And I want to be very clear that I'm not saying that this is a Islam problem or a problem with all Muslims, but there are extremists who use Islam to justify their extremist acts.
And some people have said the religion has been hijacked by extremists.
Right. And I think this is as much a problem for Muslims to deal with as everybody else, that there are extremists in the ranks. Now, the media, needs to do a better job about characterizing, how Islam plays into this or doesn't play into it, and, that these people are acting as extremists, not as Muslim extremists. But at the end of the day, I think a lot of Muslims and a wide segment of Islam needs to face the fact that there are Muslims out there who are doing this in the name of their religion.
But how do we approach the fact that, as we've seen, especially here in America, we had the underwear bomber, as he's called, who came from Nigeria, and he was a basically well-to-do family. He wasn't an impoverished young man. We had, of course, the Saudis in the 9/11 attack. These were not people without money. They were not impoverished, undereducated. These appear to be zealots. Okay, right. So is economics an issue here? In that we see in certain countries where poverty is an issue, we see more the radicalization of the undereducated, right? But in other acts, we see middle class, well-educated people taking up that cause. Right. Is that also hard for the public to discern? Is it hard for the public to sort of find out who's who?
Right. I think when it comes to the issue of grievances, whether they're economic, political, social grievances, they're there in the majority of the Middle East, in North Africa, in South Asia, and the Muslim majority countries. There are definitely transitions happening. There's authoritarianism. There has been dictatorship. There's been economic, unfortunate immobility. So you've got a lot of grievances that have happened. Yet, the majority of Muslims don't react violently. Right. I think what has happened is there has been a perversion of the theology of an ideology, where people where a very small group have come together and said, we can use religion to justify violence to ensure that our grievances are heard. Now, although it's a very small minority, a very minute minority that you might not be able to put on the scale, it is a very impactful minority. It is a minority that impacts perceptions. It's a minority that impacts other Muslims. Going back to the statistics, the majority of people who are killed by acts of terror and acts of violence in the name of Islam are Muslims themselves. Over 89% of them. If you just look at the streets of Baghdad yesterday, or you look at the streets of Karachi or Peshawar, Pakistan, or any place that you look at in the Muslim majority countries, the majority of victims are Muslims themselves. Yeah. And so Islam is not the problem, but a perversion of the ideology is the problem. And that needs to be addressed. And that narrative that you can use religion to justify violence is against the innocents, that's something that needs to be addressed.
Well, Kevin, just let me break this down a little bit, because, again, we have so many levels of this problem, in the sense that people look at Muslims as, well, those people. Mm-hmm. Maybe they're terrorists, maybe they're extremists, right? But we're also seeing the Sunni-Shia conflict, which has been going on for centuries. But it's kind of new to the American psyche. They're not really sure what's happening here. We see acts of violence in Europe and other parts of the country. But in the Western world, we're seeing these isolated terrorist attacks. How do we, in some respect, learn to digest this and figure out who's who in a religion that encompasses 1.5 billion people?
Right. And we had a fascinating debate played out on our website about 2 weeks ago with basically two Muslims arguing against each other about racial profiling and a whole number of issues and what constitutes a radical. So what it showed me is that even Muslims themselves are divided as to what this means or that means. And so you take that to the milkman in Kansas City who's never even met a Muslim, and he's completely confused. So I think really what we do and what the media needs to do is basically educate people. Here's Sunni Muslims, here's Shiite Muslims, here's the differences, here's why they sometimes don't get along. Here's why people in the West Bank have an axe to grind. Here is an explainer on the conflict in Chechnya and what has driven people to radicalization there. So I think at the end of the day, the media's responsibility is to educate. And when you're educating, you like I said, you need to be careful about the terms that you use and how you characterize people and how you characterize motives.
Well, Hywel, do you have any questions for our American guests?
Yes.
Yeah, I just want to make sure that okay, go ahead. Advocate.
I'm Yevgeny Sukhoi, and I'm joined here in the studio by our political analyst from RIA-Novosti and writer Dmitry Kosyrev, and our political analyst Dmitry Babich. And first to you, Dmitry. So many say here in Russia that one of the major sources of aggression and even violence here in Russia is Islam. What do you think about that?
Well, I think it's an absolutely irrelevant thing, is Islam and aggression in Russia. They in no way are connected. I am, like everyone else here, I'm feeling this strain, I'm feeling this radicalism growing in the society, but it's not because about Islam at all. what I'm witnessing is that the fault line is where another society's values, like for instance Euro-Atlantic society's values, are clashing here on Russian soil with some basic Russian values. The problem is that people in the West think that we are a European society. We are not. We are Asian, or maybe a society on our own, with our own mindset and values, but with a Europeanized elite, shall we say. And I'm witnessing the biggest problem and biggest radicalization here on at least two occasions. One is this unbelievable hunt for pedophiles in our society. Another one is unbelievably cruel and radical law against tobacco smoking. Both things came from America and to a less extent from Europe. And look at, for instance, at tobacco smoking. How they do that? They first of all, they are trying to ignite and inflame some radical minds in society, and to tell them that even a whiff of tobacco smoke, if it touches them, they're dead. They're sowing hysteria like with the nuclear stations. And then they use the technologies funding from abroad, the NGOs, and finally what they do is to isolate, to humiliate, to put into unbelievably cruel situation one half of Russia's population, which is smoking, and therefore improve it by pressing them into giving up smoking. Now this may be working in America. This may be more or less a European thing, but you know, I'm Orientalist. I know that nothing like this could originate from China, from India, and this is very un-Russian. And people don't understand what goes on, and the daily life is becoming unbearable because of that. And radicalism is an irrational reaction to some things which people don't even understand that they are wrong. So I suspect strongly that even in America, it's not or in England, it's not exactly the clash between Muslims and Christians. It's a clash at the edges where these two cultures, two civilizations are meeting. A clash about some daily, small, insignificant things. And some radical groups, I agree with my
colleagues.
Yes, colleagues from London's small groups somewhere are the ones who are throwing sparks in the air, but not the majority.
Dmitry, I'm afraid we're having a break now, so don't go away. Now we're having a few minutes of our news headlines. Dmitry, we're talking about this clash of civilization and Western values. What do you have to say about that?
Well, I would like to return us a little bit to the main theme of our discussion. What is it that the government is doing wrong that creates this radicalization? I absolutely agree with our colleagues in London and in Washington that Islam by itself, religion by itself, is not a problem, and it can't be a problem because Islam has existed for almost 1,500 years. And, you know, there were periods when Islamic countries were a lot more developed and actually more cultured than the Christian ones. At the time, Christianity and Europe were one thing. But, you know, let's just see why these people, why these Muslims had to come to Europe and to the United States. Why did they have to move into this new environment for them? Well, I think the problem is that the economic policies, not only of individual governments, but the economic policies of WTO, of the World Bank, they make whole countries or sometimes whole regions redundant. If something is produced in the United States or in China, this thing is no longer produced in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Iran, in Saudi Arabia. And the Muslim countries are the first to be hit by this kind of careless attitude to economics, you know, when we just do something that is economically viable and we don't care about the consequences. So this is the real problem that, you know, modern world is indeed, it's one entity. You cannot, for example, you know, when there was a terrible climate problem in Russia 2 years ago, and we had very hot weather during the summer, Egypt was not sold Russian grain, if you remember, and that was one of the reasons for the Arab Spring in Egypt, because people suddenly had bread prices up. So. And talking about culture, I again agree with our colleagues in the United States who said that a lot of people in the United States do not know the difference between Shia Muslims and Sunni Muslims. Well, what can I tell you? Well, it's very bad. Because it was not a problem in the 19th century when there were maybe a couple of thousands of Muslims living in the United States. But it's a tragedy now when you have hundreds of thousands or millions of people moving into the United States, and people there do not give a damn, and do not know what kind of people are coming to them. So indeed, it's a huge problem also in Russia, because despite the fact that we have a Muslim population, indigenous Muslim population in Russia, we are not like France or Italy. We can be a little bit compared to Spain, where there was a big Arab population, but in Spain, I'm sorry, the Arabs were actually forcefully resettled out of Spain. In Russia, somehow we managed to live together with Tatars, with people from North Caucasus. They became part of Russian society, but that doesn't excuse us from not knowing their culture, from not knowing Islam. This is something that I would like to say, and I would like to add, maybe this will be a good impulse for discussion in London or in Washington. If you look at the way modern governments are dealing with education of their nations, well, they talk about tolerance, but they don't teach the indigenous population, they don't teach their people the culture of Islamic peoples. They don't teach language only in the case if you need this language to work somewhere. They just tell people, be tolerant, which basically means don't prevent these people from competing with you in the aim of lowering yours and their wages. And that's a terrible attitude, because sooner or later you'll have to pay for that.
Well, thanks, Dmitry. I'm afraid that's all we have time for here in Moscow. We're getting to Washington now, Rick.
Yes, and Hywel, do you have any questions?
No, I'm interested in talking to my guests here in London about the Arab Spring. Yes, I'm interested in talking to my guests here in London about the Arab Spring and whether there has been hopes for a change in attitudes between the West and the Arab world, and whether they think that actually, though these hopes seem largely dashed, to be honest, whether they think perhaps there might be a new relationship between Arab world and the Western world, and also perhaps between the minorities here, and there are minorities here, and the general population. Carool, Kersten, can I just ask you that? Whether you think the Arab Spring may still, despite the many disappointments, may still cause change?
Yes, I think it will. I mean, we have seen a very different side of the Muslim world throughout the Arab Spring, that religion didn't feature that prominently in the beginning. It maybe have, in certain countries, it was hijacked because the Muslim-oriented opposition was well organized. But the issues at stake had to do with governance, openness, democratization, transparency, things like that. But another thing you have to be careful about is that if you make a comparison about the religion factor in Russia, Europe and North America, you're comparing apples and pears and oranges. Because the migrant communities have different makeups. On the mainland, there are predominantly migrant workers, and I have seen the names change from guest workers to Germans of Turkish origin or British of Pakistani origin, and suddenly in the last 10 years, they're all brushed with the same brush as Muslims. So that's a mistake. The makeup of the immigrant population in North America is very different. So the responses of these people also to development elsewhere, and especially in their home countries, which are part of the Muslim world, are different. I think the Arab Spring has been an eye-opener, that indeed the choice is not between either secular autocrats or a restoration of the caliphate or a Muslim brother take over. Egypt is in ferment because a lot of people are extremely unhappy how Mohammed Morsi is handling things. So what we have learned, I think, is, and that is the most important thing, we shouldn't talk about Islam, we should be talking about Muslims, because we are dealing with people and not some abstract. And I think that is often a sort of disappearing when you start to look for a single cause, religion, and look at a religion like Islam as in reductionist terms. And I think that is very wrong. Unfortunately, we have been talking about the media a lot. Media report news. And news often is bad, because Taufik and his family going about their normal business, as 99.9% of the Muslims is doing, doesn't make the news. And there is where education comes in, and background knowledge, which is often not exciting in news terms, but important, I think, in building up civilized populations here, as well as in the Muslim world, becomes crucial.
Do you think this
here in
seems to be
Washington-
something else we've come back to again? The role of the media in demonizing people here. Do you think that this is a real problem?
Definitely think when somebody insulted you or accuses you of things which you didn't do, you probably directly you are in the defense, this is the situation. So by one of the questions, is Islam source of extremism? One of the questions I heard, this really upset 1.5 million people. And I think this question should not be asked. The question really, Muslims, not Islam itself. You can ask, of course, anything. We are in free world. You ask anything about people behavior, people attitude, but the religion itself, you can see, is very peaceful religion, nothing wrong with it. Extremism is not a phenomenon of Islam. I can bring the Army of Lord or the Lord of Army in Kampala. I can bring ITA, Iran, many other examples, just recent example, not far away. So it has nothing to do with religion. It's a problem with the people's attitude. And maybe I disagree with Dr. Carool in the media, the role which the media should play. I think media is not only about bringing the news to the people. Media is also about educating, teaching, telling people bright stories as well as bad stories. Why always I have to report bad stories? It's not really fair. Why I have to give kind of a picture? I will paint a picture about somebody completely false of lies and accusation and insulting people. That's not really the way forward. And I think the Arab Spring did bring a lot of positive impact into the relationship between the Muslim world and the Western world. A lot of positiveness in there.
A final word perhaps from Washington now?
Yes, just one last question, if I can. Tarin, you're director of the Muslim Public Affairs Council. Now, what do you do with the Public Affairs Council? Are you, in a sense, educating the American public about the Muslim religion and the Muslim people?
Yeah, we do that. We definitely do. So we engage in programs that would help the American public, the general citizenry, understand Islam better and American Muslims as well. But I think the focus is understanding American Muslims. Understanding Islam is fine. It's abstract. It's a theology. It's a religion. But understanding your Muslim neighbor personalizes it and brings in the human factor of who that individual is, what they believe, and what their values and principles are.
Is this more about understanding culture rather than religion?
It's understanding. It is culture, religion. I think we're not monolithic individuals. We have multiple identities. I'm an American of Afghan heritage, who is Muslim, but at the same time I love basketball, and so. If we can get beyond monolithic identities and help each other understand that we're the human factor, the personal factor, I think that's the important part here.
Well, Kevin, in writing about this, in a sense, multiple identities that the Muslim community does have, does it pose a challenge for you?
It does, because it's very easy, as Harris was saying, to see somebody as a Catholic or a Muslim or a basketball player, and that's the only way that you see them, but when really they have multiple identities. So I have a little sign in my office that says, if you have put one truth into circulation or demolished one falsehood, you have done a very good day's work. And I think that's really what the media is called to do, is to, when we're talking about Islam, put truths into circulation. Here's what Muslims believe. Here's what the Quran actually says. Here's what Islam teaches. And also demolishing falsehoods. And that is, I think, in large measure, breaking down some of the stereotypes that people have about American Muslims.
Well, Harris, Tarin, Kevin Ekstrom, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much, Washington. And perhaps we just have a last quick word from our two guests here in London. Tawfiq, you first of all. Briefly, if you can, what will be the one thing that will help improve relations between Muslims and the West?
I would call for more collaboration, more openness, more constructive, positive, forward thinking and forward partnership. Treat us as a partners, not as an enemies. And this attitude will 100% bring an input into our society. We are all here living together, and we will be for the next centuries to come.
Dr. Kersten?
Well, I'm an academic, so for me the $60 million question would be, why is it that religion at present is so easily manipulated for political reasons?
Thank you both very much for appearing on the show. That's Taufik Qasimi, President of the Christian Muslim Forum and Head of the Muslim Welfare Fund, and also Dr. Carool Kersten, Senior Lecturer in the Study of Islam at King's College London. Thank you both very much for taking part.